We tried to have pieces of our service, whether the music or the themes, related to our Canada Day weekend. So we were just in the Maritimes in song, and now I'll bring you to the other side of our country, to the west, where my son was traveling this past week ago. He went to attend the funeral of his girlfriend's grandfather in Weyburn, Saskatchewan. He had originally planned to fly out for Claire's cousin's wedding, but sadly her grandpa passed away the week before, so instead the family and friends gathered the Wednesday before the Saturday wedding to celebrate his life. Jake had never had the privilege of meeting Claire's grandpa. It was unfortunate. That was one of the reasons he was excited to be going, because Claire was so close to her grandpa and grandma, and he was looking forward to meeting them. But he was privileged to gather with the family as they reminisced and shared many stories of his life as a fourth-generation farmer out west. Two things stood out for them about her grandpa Edwin. One was that he had such a calm and even-keeled temperament. Never high, never low. He took all of life's challenges with humility and humor. When he brought the best crop of his lifetime of farming, he stood back and commented, "Well, that's a fine crop of wheat." No more, no less. The only time the family ever heard him cuss or swear was one day after hours of fixing the same part of his tractor that kept breaking down. He was the man who was known to be able to fix or build anything. When it broke for the last time after several hours of effort, he muttered, and I'll give you the family version, "Well, shoot." He was also known for his grit. He never gave up. He worked hard, and he believed in forging ahead no matter what life threw at you. Anyone who knows farming or life in general knows that it comes with its ups and downs, both its challenges and its celebrations. And so it seemed fitting that the family went ahead to celebrate the first grandchild's wedding days after they buried their patriarch. Brené Brown, in her book, The Gifts of Imperfection, would describe Claire's grandfather as having a resilient spirit. She writes that to cultivate a resilient spirit, we develop what she calls protective factors that help us to manage life's ups and downs. And one of those key protective factors that she identified in her research was spirituality. She defines it as the belief in connection, both in a power greater than self, as well as interconnection with others that is grounded in love and compassion. So what does a resilient spirit look like? Is it something you're born with, or can you develop it over time? In his book entitled Resilient: How to Grow an Unshakable Core of Calm, Strength, and Happiness, Dr. Rick Hanson says that true resilience is much more than enduring terrible conditions. In fact, resilience is something that we rely on every day, whether we are raising a family, working a job, dealing with health issues, or simply getting up and out of bed each morning. He speaks on how neuroscience, mindfulness, and positive psychology can all work together to help us develop and strengthen resilience in our lives. I find it interesting that he says that the first step to having a resilient spirit is to have compassion. He defines it as the recognition of pain with the desire to relieve it, which can be self-directed or directed toward others. And it is through compassion that we recognize our basic human needs to be safe, to be satisfied, to be connected. And we recognize those needs in others as well. Ultimately, we learn through compassion toward ourselves and others how to live generous lives. When I read that a resilient spirit is developed first through a sense of compassion toward others as well as ourselves, I can't help but think of the teachings and ministry of Jesus that was so filled with compassion, and the ways he spoke to people who were marginalized, how he related to all people despite their differences or social status. He often defied social norms to reach out to those in need. He ate with tax collectors, touched lepers, healed the blind, blessed the widow and prostitute. His compassionate spirit was what led to his generous acts. His ability to identify with others' pain as well as the experience of it himself helped him better relate to others. In the Galatians passage read to this morning by Ruth, we hear Paul reflecting on what he called a spirit-led life, the signs of the spiritual life that he called fruits. And he spoke of a life lived in freedom, liberating ways of living that brought wholeness and healing to self and others. And I think in Brené Brown's language from her Gifts of Imperfection, where she describes something similar in her description of wholehearted living. She collected and analyzed all kinds of data and heard hundreds of stories of resilience. She learned how people could stay mindful and authentic under tremendous stress and anxiety, yet still transform their lives into wholehearted ways of living that I think mirror Paul's fruits of the Spirit, his description of a life of freedom. As I spoke of last week, as spiritual people, we need to take time in our lives to be apart, to be aware, and to create space where God's Spirit can guide and nurture us. And when we do it, that Spirit changes how we see the world and how we act in it. Non-church people today are looking for authentic ways to connect with one another and neighbor. And sometimes the church has come across as hypocritical because what we talk about, humility, compassion, kindness, tolerance, is not always seen as the way we act. Paul reminds us that the fruits of the Spirit, the outward expression of faith, must be visible in how we live our lives. And that rather than being a burden or a dry set of rules, it can in fact actually be a life-giving and liberating way to live. As people of faith, we are perhaps unknowingly blessed with teaching similar to what both Brené Brown and Rick Hanson talk about as protective factors or ways of developing and strengthening our resilience. It is that spiritual factor that gives us an edge when life gets challenging and difficult. When death comes a week before the wedding, when cancer takes away the life of a patriarch before his time, when we're not sure what the next day may hold for us, a resilient spirit gives us the courage to face another day with hope. But as Hanson writes, a resilient spirit needs to be practiced and intentional. He suggests that when good things happen, we take the time to live in that moment, to remember it, to set it in our experience as normal and expected. He uses the term neuroplasticity, where we can actually train or pattern our brains to act in new ways. So if you think you are more of a pessimist than an optimist, I have good news for you. You can change that. Focus on the good. Focus on compassion. Focus on gratitude, and you will begin to actually change the way your brain is wired to think and process. It is not about covering up or ignoring the pain in our lives, but rather recognizing that that's not all there is. In each moment, recognize the hurt or the anger or the pain, but also consider the good, the kind understanding of another, or the ways we are supported and loved through challenging times. The way the end of one thing can lead to a new beginning in something we might not have even considered. That, I think, is wholehearted living. That is living a life led by the Spirit that bears fruit. That is the building of a resilient spirit that will hold you up when the tractor fails and celebrate when the best crop of your life comes in. So I say, walk by the Spirit, Paul writes. When we do this, God brings gifts into our lives, things like affection for others, exuberance about life, serenity, a willingness to stick to things, a sense of compassion for others, and a conviction that a basic holiness permeates things and people. We are all original. We need no longer to force our way in life or always be in control, but we can act in wise ways. Sounds like a good way to live to me. Let's get living by the Spirit. Amen.